thank you so much to our next set of panel members here. We're delighted to be joined by Ben Willmott, who's the head of policy for the Chartered Institute for Personnel and Development. So highlighting the kind of HR professional voice here. We've also got Douglas Bilton, who's Assistant Director of Standards and Policy for Professional Standards Authority, which is the main regulator for health and social care within the UK. We've also got Iain MacMillan, who's a counter-fraud lead for the NHS National Health Services of Scotland, particularly looking at fraud issues, and also Chris Warburton, who's Health and Safety Research Officer for the trade union Prospect, which represents the kind of main professionals group of trade unions, particularly around energy and communication sectors within the UK. So what I've asked our panel members is to think about how particularly that animation might impact on their part of the world. So could I ask Ben?
Sure. Yeah, I'd just like to say, yeah, how impressed I was with the animation. I think it really brings home some insights in a really effective way. I think from a CIPD perspective, one of the key messages that comes through for us is taking account of some of the insights from the animation is the critical need to ensure your line managers have the people management skills to manage people effectively. And this is an area where CIPD has invested a lot of time and resource. We've conducted research which was initially funded by the Health and Safety Executive, looking at the management behaviours that help to prevent and manage stress in the workplace. And then we've also looked at what behaviours support employee engagement, and from that we've created a sort of a competency framework which highlights the key behaviours that managers need to demonstrate to support and manage staff effectively. And I'll just touch on them briefly, because I think sometimes the sort of positive aspect of people management gets overlooked or doesn't really get taken into account. So broadly they are, the first one is around being open, fair and consistent. So this is about managers being accessible, treating people consistently, and managing their own emotions and not passing stress on in how they manage their staff, how they turn up basically as role models. The second one is around sort of the proactive handling of conflict and people management challenges. So so managers need to be able to intervene at an early stage when they're seeing, for example, if banter is so-called banter is not that, they need to be able to intervene early. They need to make judgments about when they can resolve issues informally, when they need to use informal formal processes, at what point they need to escalate. But the key thing is to nip issues in the bud and make sure that people realize that you take difficult issues or problems seriously. The third area is around providing knowledge, clarity and guidance. So this is about the core objectives, clarity over objectives, providing constructive feedback, joint problem solving, managing workload effectively. The fourth area is around supporting development, and so making sure people have access to the training they need. You're supporting managers, support people's career development. The fifth area, I think, is particularly important for this particular conversation today. It's around how managers build and sustain relationships with the people in their teams. So, managers need to really get to know their staff. They need to really understand what's happening in their lives beyond just the workplace, because it's about getting to know people. So do you know if someone you manage, have they got a spouse, a partner, do they have a pet, where do they go on holiday? Because that's really about building trust. You know, you should be having these human conversations with people in your team. You know, do they need flexibility and support? Because the thing about trust is, if people don't trust you, they won't disclose sensitive or challenging issues. And so it's really at the heart of a positive psychological contract, and I think goes to the heart of this discussion as well. And of course, I think, you know, managers who know their people well also pick up on warning signs, you know, so changes in people's emotional response, in changes in their performance. You know, are they working excessive hours, not taking leave, or are they, you know, taking time off, you know, unnecessarily, or you know, with some, no sort of good reason. So, you know, that's why managers are fundamental to this. You know, it's a foundation. I think one of the just a couple of final points. The other thing is, you know, we know that too many organisations don't train their managers. Our research suggests only about 40% of line managers receive any training in how to manage people, which I think is quite shocking, given the centrality of the role, and, you know, how critical it is to organisations. And the other thing is, I think, you know, some people should never be line managers. You know, I think most people can learn to manage people better, but some people potentially, you know, they might need, you know, specialist, you know, technical paths that mean that they don't have to spend their time leading or managing people, if that is not their skill set. I'll leave it there, but look forward to any questions.
Thank you. So Douglas, I mean, you're working regulating a sector that's had huge consequences to do with the pandemic that have really changed the working context, as Ben was kind of alluding to. What do you think in terms of the animation and issues for staff going forward?
I think it's worth reflecting as well, before I go on to directly answer your question, Ros, just what we're hearing today about the depletion of the health workforce from the pandemic. It's also recently we've commissioned research which we'll be publishing soon, which would suggest that many health and care practitioners have a residue of moral injury and moral distress from their experiences over the last year, the consequences of which and how those will be repaired and remedied, I don't think we know yet. However, to respond directly to the animation, prevention of harm to patients is one of the strategic aims of the regulators, and all of the things that regulators do are in different ways have an impact on preventing harm from happening. So the input controls of who goes onto the regulator's register, the standards that regulators set of conduct and behaviour, obviously their fitness to practice processes through which they hear allegations of misconduct, and also their role in quality assuring higher education courses that can lead to registration. However, I don't think that at the moment, the literature on counterproductive work behaviour is actually very well recognised in the sector. I mean, Ros, the work that you and colleagues and I have done to see the value that we can extract from the fitness to practice data that we have, the data that arises from those cases, the records that those cases generate, has broken, I think, some very thick ice in that respect, in terms of realizing that data has real value and even despite the fact that it's been accumulated in pursuit of a legal process, nevertheless, it has value. We can learn from it. And also, there is this body of literature which is, as I said, I don't think it's been fully appreciated that it's there, and that we can do more to think through and work through how the various challenges that counterproductive work behaviour in health settings presents could be addressed through the insights that come through this area of research. I mean, for example, I was particularly interested in some of the examples that came through the presentations. The idea of role-playing and scenarios, thinking through with health professionals about difficult moral choices, I think that's in common with other interventions that I think would be very effective and which regulators can support, and that's supporting both through, it's the position that they occupy has, there are sort of two routes in. They've got their direct route, their direct relationship with their registrants, but then they've also got the opportunity to feed back into employers and into employment settings the insights that arise, particularly from fitness to practice cases. So there are two routes in. The idea, and one of the things that I've noticed about the interventions that are successful here are that they bring into consciousness things that might otherwise be unconscious. They make people think about decisions that they take that might otherwise be taken in a semi-conscious or unconscious way. And it sounds like in doing so, it activates people's moral compass.
That's a really good intervention and observation. And certainly we've got an awful lot more work to do across Europe, well, across the world, I think, actually, in terms of healthcare. And as you said, very much in terms of thinking about this group who've been so amazing through the pandemic and what are the consequences for them of those experiences. So I just wonder, Iain, that kind of builds really nicely on the work you've been doing with the Counterfraud unit, again, working in a health context, but I think it has wider implications, doesn't it, for other businesses? Do you want to come in here?
Yes, indeed, Ros, and good morning, everybody. Yeah, the peculiar circumstances of health of the last year, I think will teach us some further lessons in this area. But you know, in terms of the animation, first off, one of the most interesting things that I found was, or the messages that came through, was the attempts to filter out the narcissist, the dangerous characters at the recruitment stage. But what, and that's great, but it's just, for me, the unknown is the potential for other people to just temporarily step into that area of bad behaviour. And so it got me thinking about the common fraud model, Donald Cressey's model of opportunity, motivation and rationale. And as Ben knows, and perhaps everybody knows, that in health, such large organisations, there's vast opportunities for wrongdoing, for theft, for fraud, even embezzlement happens fairly often because it's a high trust environment with low controls, and for very good reasons. But the second issue was about motivation, and the animation was talking a lot about motivations that are driven by workplace situations, and it's not really my experience. That is quite rare. I see that more when I do a management investigation in bullying and harassment, where a workplace has driven people towards behaving in a certain unacceptable way. But actually, in the criminal sense, in acquisitive crime, it's not so. It's about personal motivations. It's about addictions. It's about debt. It's about emotions. And so motivations is still really consistently personal. But the rationalization, when I started in this business 20 years ago, I believed that every person who committed fraud applied the reasonable person test, and we all had one level of rationalization when we measured the benefits of the crime versus the likelihood of detection and the punishment that may follow from that. But actually, the work that you and your colleagues do is really helping to unpack that whole issue, and the idea that I think the moral disengagement idea that Roberta was discussing today is really, really interesting, and it ties in with issues of self-deceit, which I'm particularly interested in. That those and the flexibility of it, those who can suppress the truth and start to believe the untruth are better at lying to others. I think evolutionary, that's a skill that we have developed. So therefore, when I think of cases in the health service, perhaps a chief executive, and I won't talk about specific cases, but let's imagine a chief executive who lies on their CV to become the chief executive of an organisation. As soon as they have taken up that position, I am sure that their moral standards would reinstate themselves, and they wouldn't allow that type of behaviour in the organisation. But the other thing for me is, having spent 20 years looking into the faces of people who have been apprehended, the victim does not always perceive themselves as bad. In fact, the vast majority perceive themselves, the perpetrator perceive themselves as a victim. There's generally an intention to put things right over a period of time. So you embezzle money, but you intend to repay it. And that protects this moral self. So there's all kinds of unpacking of that and the temporary nature of rationalisation and how it can change with circumstance that I find fascinating from this work. There's perhaps one slight thing around corruption that I'm still left puzzled by. So if we imagine a procurement organisation that's been corrupted, perhaps for large bribes for those at the top of the organisation, but perhaps some small level of hospitality, meals and tickets to the theatre or a concert for those that work within the department at lower level. Those people working at a lower level, to me, are not coming across as corrupted bad apples, but they're in some way silenced by the corruption of merely accepting something recommended by their boss. So it's almost like you're trapped, a good apple trapped within a bad barrel, which I haven't quite got my head around. But having the two practical things I'm taking out from this is that when there's an incident, a fraud or a corruption or theft incident, we report, my team reports to management about what they can do about it. But those reports only talk about controls within the organisation. They don't talk about that psychological phase and triggers and red flags that perhaps could have been picked up upon. And that's really an opportunity for me to try, particularly in corruptions where that type of thing is amongst several people and should be spotted. And finally, in training, and Ros, we met 2 or 3 years ago, and soon after I started to adapt my training for line managers across the health boards to take more of a less accusatory or just a different approach to speaking to managers about the staff, more of a narrative about how good people went bad and how their relationship with their employees is a caring relationship, and that by knowing what's going on within their personal life can help to save them at an earlier stage from falling into something that for me becomes crime or other bad behaviours. So I certainly want to build on that training opportunity using the learning from the work of yourself and others.
Thank you, Iain. And I think you've got some really nice examples through the talks about different training interventions and how those might run. So, Chris, I mean, your work involves a whole range, a much wider range of different businesses, particularly with a trade union perspective on it, and in terms particularly linking in with what Michael was talking about, adding voice for people there. Can you come in and share with us your insights looking at the animation?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Ros. Yeah, the animation is excellent, and I think is really valuable. And I kind of approach this partly as a health and safety practitioner, as well as someone looking at accidents and incidents, as well as things that drive stress and mental health problems in the workplace. And Maybe some health and safety practitioners would disagree, but I think that particularly in this area, this idea, there's quite a common idea that people are fundamentally rational and will follow procedures in a rational manner and will behave in anticipated and expected ways, as though might deviate from a kind of perfect way of behaving. So the animation, the value, I think, is partly in specifying ways in which people don't behave in kind of anticipated ways. People behave in undesirable ways. So a lot of my work is, as you said, is in the energy sector. So we represent people working from nuclear power stations through to decommissioning nuclear facilities, to transmitting electricity and stuff like that. But we also have members in aviation, so air traffic controllers. And some parts of the energy sector are better than others, but aviation tends to be pretty good. I mean, that is partly regulated. They have a just culture that regulates, just culture regulation that regulates kind of expectations and standards for reporting incidents and accidents and deviation from kind of desired kind of expectations. So one of the ways that I often see kind of deviation from expectation manifest itself is in things like accident investigation. So I'll quite often see accident investigations that will say something like, well, X person just didn't follow the procedure. And that's kind of as far as it goes, and there's often a lack of willingness to kind of delve into the circumstances as to why they didn't follow the procedure. I think in a lot of the places that I deal with, a lot of the employees, a lot of that is to do with things like workload. I think a lot of that is to do with fatigue, which are probably two different sides of the same coin. And people, I think, generally want to do a good job and don't want to engage in dangerous activities. But sometimes because they're fatigued, because they're stressed, maybe because the procedures that they're following fundamentally don't make sense and fundamentally don't match up to the circumstances in which they're working, then something unexpected happens. And so I think one of the keys to that is I might say this as a health and safety person is risk assessment, is a proper risk assessment, but a risk assessment that anticipates in advance how people might deviate, or the impact that stress might have on people, or the impact that fatigue might have on people. And one of the ways that you have to do that is through consultation, effective consultation. And a lot of the work that I do, producing guidance and information and a kind of advising people, is advising people who are engaging in collective bargaining, and that is one of the ways that you get the most sound, the most kind of watertight procedures that will kind of anticipate the ways that people might behave in undesirable ways. But more broadly, consultation on policy and practice, that's really important, and a lot of our reps really value policies as a place to start, as a policy has been consulted on, is something that they can hold their employee to account on, if nothing else. And also, I just finally say that we've said that we've got members working in air traffic control, and they've done some really valuable work looking at how to implement a just culture in organisations outside of the aviation industry through the European Transport Workers Federation. And that's really valuable, and that talks, that's kind of the starting point of that is consulting, building trust and consulting. One of the ways that you do that is consulting on a policy, but ensuring that as part of the policy, people aren't blamed for acting in ways that are undesirable or unexpected. So I think that the animation really helps to kind of draw out some of those strands and some of the reasons people may not behave in an ideal manner.
We've got a question, and thank you all for coming with your different perspectives, but I guess this is a kind of one that covers all of your areas, which is management by walking around is an important tool, but often people are pressured into leading by emails. And in particular, as we've heard, we're taking out those management roles that can help detect these. So what do you think we could do to counter this process is the question. Anyone want to go first?
Well, I'll kick off. I suppose, I mean, I would go back to the importance of managers building time every week to have quality conversations with everybody that they manage directly, and you know, those conversations should be as much about strengthening and building their relationship, their working relationship, as about the work itself. And I think that, you know, because I think that, you know, the sort of that means you're not necessarily, you're looking at performance in the rounds, and so when you're thinking, when people are sending emails, or if they're, you know, making sort of random, they're making less sort of random sort of management, using, sorry, let me rephrase that, using less random management approaches. They're being consistent, and they are you know, creating the environment where they have a trust-based relationship with individuals, and they really understand that individual, and they're talking about workload on a regular basis, and so, you know, that the issues around sort of you know, emails driving, you know, sort of work intensity or expectations are managed at source.
Thank you. Thank you. Anyone else got any views on that? Management by
go. This is a pre-pandemic answer first, and then I'll try and do a post-pandemic answer. I think the pre-pandemic answer would be that, I can't remember now where it was in one of the presentations, it reminded me of the example of the nursery nurse in the south of England some years ago who abused infants in her care, and how she exploited the physical attributes of the workplace that she was in to create private spaces in which she conducted her vile abuse. And it was just an example of how, without walking around, without seeing what's going on, without knowing the territory, you can't see into the corners, you can't see what's going on, you can't, and you can't sort of, you know, see how other people might be taking opportunities to act in counterproductive and abusive ways. So walking around is so important, and also and this is where it gets a bit more post-pandemic, and as we think about how we're going to go back into workplaces and what have we been missing when we haven't been able to walk around and talk to each other in more informal ways over this past year. And I think we've lost a huge amount by not being able to do that. Despite the fact that we've all kept the show on the road as best we all can, there's so much that can't be done without walking around. I'm thinking of things like being able to pick up on the subtle signals that people aren't well or aren't happy. It's not being able to go up to somebody after a meeting and say, I don't think that went very well for you. You know, how are you feeling about that? Or just to ask them how their weekend was, because you think they might have not been looking themselves. And that it's picking up those early signs of things not being right, which I think which is of course so important to nipping problems in the bud, that I think we've really missed working through in these ways.
Can I just on that? I mean, I do think we need to acknowledge that you know, there will be more, you know, home and hybrid working post-pandemic. And so, you know, we've got to get better at managing people remotely. I completely agree that, you know, probably for most people, a blend is, you know, and for most businesses, but a blend might be better. But, you know, we, as managers, we've got to get better at how we manage and support people remotely and in hybrid ways. So, but I also completely agree with Douglas. It's, you know, it's a mix, isn't it? It's a balance. and finding that right balance is, we're probably all going to have to learn, as employers, as managers, as individuals, as the next few months unfold.
And thank you, Douglas, particularly for reminding us about that, walking around, particularly where we add more and more surveillance around, we often miss the things that aren't being surveilled, are actually particularly thinking about perpetrators. Not only they select environments that they can exploit, but they also create them in particular ways. So it's only, as you said, by actually noticing and wandering around and talking to the people that you can really start to pick up and detect that something might not be quite right here. Would anybody else like to add in?
I was going to say, I think it depends on who the manager is who's doing the walking around. I think that there's, one of bugbears of a lot of our members is employers are always very, very keen to move to open plan offices, increasingly, but a lot of people don't really like that and aren't comfortable with the kind of visibility that that gives, and also the kind of surveillance by managers. Makes people feel uncomfortable. And I think I was kind of looking into some studies that had been done, and I think a lot of that is about a kind of power imbalance. And so people who feel they have less power in the workplace or are disadvantaged in some way in the workplace feel a lot more vulnerable in these kinds of circumstances where they are being or feel that they're being surveilled. However, undoubtedly there is a lot of value in this. And I agree with what my colleagues have said. One of the experiences that we often have, thinking about the energy sector and fatigue, often, a lot of people complain about all they get is, when they've been working kind of 12, 13, 14, 15 hours on a shift, is a text message to say, are you okay? Are you okay to carry on working? And I think that kind of human contact, and it's usually because the manager's so busy, they don't have the opportunity to actually go and speak to them. That human contact does help pick up a lot of these problems. Before lockdown, I used to talk a lot about kind of social support, social identities, social support, and the value of that. There's some really interesting studies around this that show how valuable social support is for our physical health as well as our mental health, just really kind of how incredible it is. And I think that if we didn't intuitively know it, we kind of explicitly recognize that, I think, after a year and a half in lockdown. And I think that we're all kind of highly cognizant of the how beneficial it is to share experiences, to talk with colleagues. So I think even if we do go back, even if we do stay working at home to a certain extent in the future, I think people are going to really kind of cling to those social support networks that they have and that are offered by colleagues in the workplace.
Such a good point about how much we've missed those interactions and support for each other. I had a colleague mail me yesterday because he noticed something in the press, and he was like, oh, I saw that. And I was like, oh, somebody noticed. It makes a huge difference, doesn't it, to people? Iain, do you just want to come in? Because I'm just aware we're on our last 3 minutes and I really want us to finish on time. So I'm going to be bully there.
But yes, I was just going to say of professional concern to me is the decrease in sort of whistleblowing for fraud behaviour. I think we may be experiencing as much as a 30% decrease over last year, whereas the incidence of fraud, theft and other activities has gone in the opposite direction. So there's certainly an absence of anybody in the office space to monitor what's going on. So we need to adapt to that and make sure that we are safeguarding our assets in the absence of people.
So thank you very much, professional panel. Can I ask my colleagues, Deanne, Roberta and Michael, to put your cameras on as well, and Alfie and Christine? So I'd just like to do a massive thank you to everybody who's been involved, both front-facing and behind the scenes, on putting forward this event. We will be taking these recordings and we will be subtitling them and putting them onto our YouTube channel as soon as we possibly can. You will also see in that YouTube channel, there's an English variant, which is the one that you saw with English subtitles. We've also created a whole load of other language variants for our animation going forward. In terms of future events from the Impact Incubator, in November, as part of Living Wage Week, we will be launching some more work around living wages and a serious game there. And we hope to be doing some more serious games work, particularly looking at the threats and securities area, because you'll see we've got a wealth of science that we can start to look at those predictive relationships. So if you're interested in being involved in that or helping us to fund that, then please do give us a shout out. We also have in Glasgow in January the EAWOPii conference, and again the Impact Incubator, we have a whole half day that will be devoted to looking at these issues and taking them forward. So again, be part of that. But if you want to follow us on Twitter, it's EAWOPL or EAWOPii, I think. And also you'll see that at the end of these slides, we will be emailing everybody who signed up to come in as attenders to this event, just to keep them alert to what's happening. But I would just like to do a massive shout out to Roberta Fida, who's the Threats and Securities Lead for the Impact Incubator, and to my stellar colleagues Iain and Hartock, Michael Knowles, Iain MacMillan, Ben Willmott, Chris Warburton, and Douglas Bilton. Thank you very, very much for all of your time today. So thank you, and that's us.